let me start my screen share. Okay, can everyone see that now? Yeah, okay, great. So let me move that aside. Okay, so I've entitled this talk as Light Shines Infinitely, the Similar Yet Dissimilar Ways of Nichiren and Shinran. And I just want to thank you for inviting me to give this talk. And also, because I know there will be people here from both the Jōdo Shinshū and Nichiren Shu and other interested parties, I'm going to talk equally about the views and practices of both, with the assumption that not everyone here will be familiar with Nichiren, not everyone here will be familiar with Shinran. Also, what I'm going to present will just be bare outline, scratching the surface. I can't presume to get into all the details of it. And I'm also going to kind of steer away from some of the sharper polemical points, and just present both their doctrines positively as I would hope they present them. Now, of course, I'm not a Jōdo Shinshū minister, so I'm open to being corrected on points of Nichiren, of Shinran's doctrine. So I'm just going to present my understanding of what his teaching is. So let me move along here. So here I want to talk about Shinran, who lived from 1173 to 1263, and Nichiren, who lived from 1222 to 1282. And as you can see, their lives overlapped, and they lived during a time of great change when the imperial government of Kyoto was taken over by the samurai clans from the outside provinces, and who set up the Kamakura shogunate, which was centered in the city of Kamakura. Now, Shinran, just to give a little background about their lives, Shinran was from the aristocratic Fujiwara clan, and he was ordained in the Tendai school probably during the Genpei War, when the samurai were just taking over and establishing the shogunate. So it was a time of great turmoil and social change. In the year 1201, he met Honen, who was the founder of the Jōdo Shu tradition in Japan. Now, of course, all throughout East Asian Buddhism, generally, people chanted the Nembutsu, but what Honen was teaching, based on his predecessors in China, such as Shandao, was more of a exclusive Nembutsu movement. So it was a little different than the Nembutsu that had been practiced before. So Shinran became a disciple of Honen. And when Honen's following got into trouble with the government and the Tendai monks, especially because of a scandal created by two of his followers with some ladies in the imperial court, Honen and Shinran ended up being exiled in the year 1207. And Shinran was sent to Echigo, which is now Niigata Prefecture, where I just had some really good beer from Niigata. In fact, when I was just in Japan a couple of weeks ago. So, you know, it's still, I guess, a fairly rural area, a lot of agriculture up there. And Shinran became a farmer, and he took the name Gutoku, or foolish bald-headed one. And there he married a woman named Eshini and had 7 children. So he became neither monk nor layman, as he put it. In 1211, he and Honen and others were pardoned from their exile. So he moved to the area, an area in the Kanto, which would now be north of where Tokyo is. But in 1234, he returned to Kyoto, and he died at the age of 90. So that, in short, is in the year 1263. So that, in short, is Shinran's life. Nichiren was born to, as he put it, a family of fishermen, and he also, because of his talents, was able to become a Tendai monk. And after years of study, he decided that the Lotus Sutra was the chief or most important teaching of Shakyamuni Buddha, and criticized the other schools of his time and the government's patronage of them. And for that, he lived a life of constant persecution. There were riots, 2 exiles, an attempted execution, and so forth. And he eventually retired at a place called Mount Minobu, where there is now the Koanji Temple, the head temple of the Nichiren Shu. And he died in 1282. So, as some of you, as most of you may know, the Jōdo Shinshū is about chanting the Nembutsu. So here I want you to hear a little bit about how it's chanted in the Higashi Hongangi. So let me see if I can, whoops, see if I can play this. Oh, I'm having a little trouble here. Okay, well, seems like I'm having trouble playing the video, so I'm going to just skip. Oh, okay. Let me try again. Huh. Well, all right, I'm gonna skip that part. So, as you know, in Jōdo Shinshū, there is the chanting of Namu Amida Butsu, and in the Nichiren Shu, the main practice is chanting Namu Myoho Renge Kyo. And before I get into Shinran and Nichiren's particular views, I want to point out that both of these could be called a form of Dharma Smriti or Buddhana Smriti. Dharma Smriti is a Sanskrit word that means mindfulness or recollection of the Dharma. And Namu Myoho Renge Kyo is a praise of the Buddha's teaching. The wonderful Dharma is a form of that. And Buddhana Smriti is the practice of being mindful or recollecting the Buddha. And chanting Namu Amida Butsu, or devotion to the Buddha of infinite light, would be a form of that. These are practices that go back to probably the time of the historical Buddha, because we find in, for instance, the number discourses of the Buddha that the Buddha speaks of these among a group of 6 practices of mindfulness or recollection, the other 4 being bringing to mind the Sangha, virtuous conduct, generosity, and the heavenly deities. But for now, I just want to focus on these first 2. So in the numerical discourses, the Buddha talks about all the benefits that come from recollecting the Buddha or recollecting the Dharma, and basically enumerates the same kind of benefits. So just running down this list, we have the mind is not obsessed by lust, hatred, or delusion. The mind of the practitioner is simply straight. The practitioner will gain inspiration in the meaning, gain inspiration in the Dharma, gain joy connected with the Dharma. Rapture arises in the practitioner of this practice. The body becomes tranquil. The body feels pleasure. The mind becomes concentrated. The practitioner will be able to dwell in balance and dwell unafflicted, and finally enter the stream of the Dharma. And if this in fact refers to stream entry, that means that from that point on, the practitioner of recollecting the Buddha or the Dharma will no longer fall into the 4 lower or lowest worlds of transmigration, the hells, the hungry ghosts, the animals, the fighting demons. So one is very much on track, and within at least 7 lifetimes will attain nirvana. Now, a little later, as in around the 6th century, if I remember correctly, the Theravadan teacher Buddhaghosa wrote the Visuddhimagga, or Path of Purification, in which he also elucidated the benefits of these practices of recollecting the Buddha, recollecting the Dharma, and pretty much says that they have the same benefits. One is respectful and deferential to the master. One will have fullness of faith, mindfulness, understanding, and merit. One will gain much happiness and gladness. One will be able to conquer fear and dread. One will be able to endure pain. One will be living in the presence of either the Buddha or the Dharma, depending on which one is recollecting. One will have a body worthy of veneration as a shrine room. I find that an interesting one. And one's mind will tend towards the plane of the Buddhas, if one is recollecting the Buddha, or one will have a realization of the peerless Dharma, if one is recollecting the Dharma. And finally, vivid awareness of conscience and shame. One thing I would like to say is that about these 2 practices is recollection of the Buddha, at least in the Pali Canon and in terms of Theravadan practice, is not just saying a name of a Buddha, but is specifically recollecting all the qualities and sometimes the 32 marks and such of Shakyamuni Buddha. Whereas recollecting of the Dharma is recollecting all the qualities of the Dharma. Although sometimes, well, not just sometimes, but most often you will find in many discourses where At the end of it, the discourse will say what benefits the hearers received from hearing the discourse, and then someone will ask, well, what should we call this discourse? And you might wonder, well, who cares what you call it? you know? But the purpose of that was by giving a discourse a name, one could just think of that name and thereby think of all of the things that that discourse is about, bring to mind the point of the discourse through an image and captured in the title. So one can see how the practices of um, Dharma Shmirti and Buddhana Shmirti might evolve eventually to more streamlined practices such as the Nembutsu or the Daimoku. Now, in comparing traditions, it seems to me for a long time now that one can talk about superficial differences, superficial similarities, actual differences, and actual similarities. And real dialogue needs to recognize these levels. So I'm not going to be able to cover all these points in this talk, but I at least want to go over some of these things here, at least as I see it. So in talking about the Buddha, which Buddha do we revere in our respective traditions? Superficially, of course, there's an obvious difference, either the eternal Shakyamuni Buddha or Amitabha Buddha. But someone, particularly an outsider, might point to the fact that we're both devoting to ourselves to an eternal Buddha figure. So I would say, though, that that's a superficial similarity. And if you get beneath that, you have to ask, well, what is the role of Shakyamuni Buddha? Or how does that Shakyamuni Buddha relate to the eternal Buddha, or the eternal Buddha relate to Shakyamuni Buddha? And there, I think you will find an actual difference between our traditions. And then even beyond that, one might ask, what is the existential difference? Or the existential, not difference, but similarity? In which case one might talk about the Buddha's presence, however one may call it or name it. In terms of practice, the obvious difference is Nichiren Shu practices Daimoku, Jōdo Shinshū practices Nembutsu. The outsider would say, well, who cares? You both chant. In fact, many introductory books on Buddhism written in English for the public just lumps Nichiren Buddhism in as a type of Pure Land Buddhism, which I do not agree with that. But it's because from the outside they say, well, they both chant and they're both devotional. But I think there's an actual difference here. One is mindfulness of the Dharma and taking that stance to its limit, and the other one is taking mindfulness of the Buddha as a practice to its limit. And then, of course, there's the existential similarity of both are cultivating a single-minded devotion that will eventually take us out of ourselves to a realization of no self. The power at work, superficially, the one tradition works through salvation by the Lotus Sutra, the other through Amitabha Buddha. Both seem to be talking about a salvation by a power outside oneself, whether an other Buddha who stands over and against one. And again, I'm talking about a superficial similarity, what, say, an outsider might see. So this is really not necessarily accurate. And then the other one would say, well, the other tradition looks to the Lotus Sutra, taught by an eternal Shakyamuni Buddha for salvation. But when you look at what is the actual difference, we're talking about either Dharma power, the power of Myoho Renge Kyo, or we're talking about other power, the power of Amitabha Buddha, and what that really means. And this leads again to the actual existential similarity of a realization of no self or other. At least this is how my understanding at this time. And beyond that, we can talk about the mutual possession of the 10 realms, which I'll get into a little bit later, are the workings of the original vow of the Buddha. And these can lead to an understanding of intersubjectivity, which would be the deeper similarity. Also, there's differences in attitude. You can see this for yourselves if you're looking at the screen here. One tradition may seem aggressive, one is easygoing, both are devotional. There's an actual difference in that perhaps more humility is cultivated in one tradition, whereas the quality of perseverance is encouraged in the other tradition. Both traditions are cultivating a sense of faith and joy. The result, one tradition talks about rebirth in the Pure Land of Eagle Peak, the other talks about the Pure Land of Utmost Bliss. Both talk about a rebirth in a Pure Land, However, the real difference may be one tradition Nichiren Shu talks about Sokushin Jobutsu, or attaining Buddhahood in one's very body. The other one talks about Shinjin, which is the mind of faith and assurance that one will be reborn in the Pure Land after death. That seems to be a real difference. On the other hand, both Shinran and Nichiren talked about non-retrogression, which I'll get more into later. So as you can see, an outsider might see our superficial differences and similarities, but when you delve deeper into the traditions, I think you will get to the actual differences, and perhaps beyond that to actual, or what I would think of as existential similarities. First, I would like to present an outline of Shinran's teachings as I understand them. So we'll begin with his view of Amitabha, or Amitayus Buddha. Amitabha, by the way, is a Sanskrit word that means infinite light. Amitayus means infinite life. These two names are used interchangeably, although some Buddhist traditions would differentiate them. But in my understanding is in Pure Land Buddhism, they are seen as two names for the same Buddha. And in fact, the Amida in Japanese is a transliteration that could be of either. So in the Hymns of the Pure Land, Shinran wrote, "It is taught that kalpas have now passed since Amida attained Buddhahood, but he seems a Buddha more ancient than kalpas, countless as particles." So oftentimes Amida is viewed as what is called a reward body, or the Sambhogakaya. This is an idealized Buddha who lives in a heavenly Pure Land that only very advanced bodhisattvas can perceive. And a reward body Buddha, or fulfilled body Buddha, comes about when a sentient being attains enlightenment, or full enlightenment, perfect and complete unsurpassed awakening. And there is the full fruition of the many eons of cultivation of merit and wisdom that they have undergone. So it's kind of a manifestation or a personification of all of that wisdom and merit. So the reward body has a beginning, that moment of awakening, but an indefinite end, as these idealized Buddhas in the Pure Lands can reside there or abide there for countless kalpas. But here Shinran is saying that Amida Buddha seems to be more ancient than kalpas countless as particles. So he's not relating to him as merely a reward body with a finite beginning and an indefinite end. And in fact, he also writes, this is from, let me see here, here we go. This is from his True Teaching, Practice, and Realization of the Pure Land Way, the Jōdo Shinshū. The supreme nirvana is uncreated Dharma body. Uncreated Dharma body is true reality. True reality is Dharma nature. Dharma nature is suchness. Suchness is oneness. Amida Tathagata comes forth from suchness and manifests various bodies, fulfilled, accommodated, and transformed. So here we see Shinran assimilating Amida Buddha to suchness, or the Dharma body, and the other bodies as being kind of emanations or coming from him. He also writes further on in True Teaching, Practice, and Realization, because all Buddhas and Bodhisattvas have Dharma bodies of two dimensions. Dharma body is suchness, and Dharma body is compassionate means. Dharma body as compassionate means arises from Dharma body as suchness, and Dharma body as suchness emerges out of the Dharma body as compassionate means. These two dimensions of Dharma body differ but are not separable. They are one but cannot be regarded as identical. So this is in line with the teachings of a 5th century, or 6th century, really, Chinese teacher of Pure Land Buddhism, Tan Luan, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, which I'm probably not, but Tan Luan. And Tan Luan taught that the Buddha has, or the Dharma body, the true nature of reality, has two dimensions. There's the Dharma body of suchness, which is what a Buddha awakens to, and then there's the Dharma body of compassionate, skillful means. And the different Buddhas that advanced bodhisattvas can perceive in the Pure Land, or that ordinary people can perceive, the accommodative body of a historical Buddha on earth, are manifestations of this Dharma body as compassionate means. So Tan Luan and Shinran basically saw Amitabha Buddha as connected with these Dharma body of suchness and Dharma body as compassionate means, as Amitabha having these two dimensions. Now, again, in Shinran, in his Hymns of the Pure Land, wrote, Amida, who attained Buddhahood in the infinite past, full of compassion for foolish beings of the five defilements, took the form of Shakyamuni Buddha and appeared in Gaia. So, from Shinran's point of view, Amida isn't just a reward body, but is in fact the Dharma body as suchness and as compassion. And Shakyamuni Buddha now is just an appearance of Amitabha Buddha. So now we should ask, why did Shakyamuni Buddha, who Shinran believed was an appearance of Amida, teach the Pure Land Sutras? So in his passages on the Pure Land Way, Shinran wrote the following. To begin, the teaching of the Pure Land Way is found in the larger sutra of the Buddha of Immeasurable Life. The central purport of this sutra is that Amida, by establishing the incomparable vows, has opened wide the Dharma storehouse, and full of compassion for small foolish beings, selects and bestows the treasure of virtues. It reveals that Shakyamuni appeared in this world and expounded the teachings of the way to enlightenment, seeking to save the multitudes of living beings by blessing them with the benefit that is true and real. Assuredly, this sutra is the true teaching for which the Tathagata appeared in the world. It is the wondrous scripture, rare and most excellent. It is conclusive and ultimate exposition of the one vehicle, and so on. To teach, well, actually, I should just read the rest. It is the right teaching, praised by all the Buddhas throughout the 10 quarters. To teach the Tathagata's primal vow is the true intent of this sutra. The name of the Buddha is its essence. So Shinran believed that Shakyamuni Buddha appeared in this world in order to expound the larger sutra, the Buddha of Immeasurable Life, and which is expounded the primal vow, the true intent of that sutra. He says in his Hymns of the Pure Land that the fundamental intent for which the Buddha appeared in the world was to reveal the truth and reality of the primal vow. So here again, Shinran plainly states that the purpose of Shakyamuni Buddha's teaching was to reveal the truth of the primal vow, the 18th vow of Amitabha Buddha, that guarantees the salvation of all who chant the Nembutsu. So let's look at this original vow. To begin with, Amitabha Buddha was supposed to have, before becoming a Buddha, been a king who renounced his throne, became a bodhisattva named Dharmakara, or Dharma Treasury, who then made 48 vows that if he was able to attain Buddhahood, people would be able to do such things as be born in his Pure Land, have his name pronounced by all the Buddhas throughout the universe so that people could hear that name and be saved, that all who were born in his Pure Land could immediately attain Buddhahood, or begin to fulfill the vows of Samantabhadra and appear as bodhisattvas throughout the universe, and so forth. So the 18th vow of these 48 vows in the larger sutra is the one considered the most important. This is the one that says, if when I attain Buddhahood, sentient beings in the lands of the 10 directions, who sincerely and joyfully entrust themselves to me, desire to be born in my land and call my name even 10 times, should not be born there, may I not attain perfect enlightenment. Excluded, however, are those who commit the 5 gravest offenses and abuse the right Dharma. The word abuse could also be translated as slander. Though I'm not going to get into polemics in this discussion, I do want to point out that from Nichiren's reading of this, those who denigrated the Lotus Sutra were committing slander of the right Dharma, and therefore were going against the wording of this vow. Whereas Shinran understood this to be a warning of how serious those offenses were, but that in reality, Amida would not exclude anyone. So there is a very sharp difference of opinion on the implications of this vow. Now, further on in the sutra, we find this statement about the fulfillment of that vow. All sentient beings who, having heard his name, rejoice in faith, remember him even once, and sincerely transfer the merit of virtuous practices to that land, aspiring to be born there, will attain birth and dwell in the state of non-retrogression. But excluded are those who have committed the 5 gravest offenses and abused the right Dharma. So note that it says that those who attain birth and dwell in the Pure Land of Amida Buddha will dwell in the stage of non-retrogression. That is an important point I want to come back to later. And also, this passage talks about 3 kinds of minds, of sincerity, transferring merit to the Pure Land, or aspiration to be born there, and so on. I'm not going to be getting into the three kinds of minds that Shinran and Honen talked about at great length in this talk, but it is a definitely an area of great interest to explore. So, why chant the Nembutsu? It should already be clear why Nembutsu is chanted in Pure Land Buddhism. It is to accord with the primal vow of Amitabha Buddha that assures that anyone chanting his name will be born in the Pure Land. But how specifically did Shinran relate to the chanting of Nembutsu? So there is the Tanisho, our record and lament of divergences, that records things that Shinran is reported to have said. And in one passage, he says, "For by virtue of being shone upon by Amida's light, we receive the diamond-like Shinjin, our mind of faith, when the one thought moment of entrusting arises within us. Hence, already in that instant, Amida takes us into the stage of the truly settled, and when our lives end, all our blind passions and obstructions of evil being transformed, we are brought to realize insight into the non-origination of all existence." In other words, realizing the emptiness of all things. Thus, the Nembutsu that we say throughout a lifetime with the thought, "If it were not for this compassionate vow, how could such wretched evildoers as ourselves gain emancipation from birth and death?" should be recognized as entirely the expression of our gratitude for the benevolence and our thankfulness for the virtuous working of the Tathagata's great compassion. So for Shinran, Nembutsu is not chanted as our own practice for building up merit or earning rebirth in the Pure Land. Rather, it is a practice that Amida gives to us. And the Nembutsu that people chant when they realize this mind of faith within themselves, that they are assured of rebirth in the Pure Land, is expressed through the Nembutsu. And this happens in an instant. But throughout one's lifetime, after having that assurance, one chants the Nembutsu as an expression of gratitude. And also, I would presume, as a way of further spreading the Nembutsu to others and vocalizing it. Now, other power. So, as I just said, the Nembutsu, from Shinran's point of view, is not one's own practice or working. It is the working of the other, of Amida in oneself. So here we find a real difference between Shinran and Nichiren. Shinran unequivocally teaches that one is saved through other power, while many believe, including many Nichiren Buddhists, that their practice is based upon a power within. So, let's see if this is actually the case. So once again, in Record of Lament of Divergences, Shinran is reported to have taught, "The Nembutsu for its practitioners is not a practice or a good act. Since it is not performed out of one's own designs, it is not a practice. Since it is not good done through one's own calculations, it is not a good act. Because it arises wholly from other power and is free of self-power. For the practicer, it is not a practice or a good act." So it seems pretty unequivocal that in Jōdo Shinshū, one relies upon other power, not any kind of self-power or any mixture between the two. And further on in Record in Lament of Divergences, Shinran says, "Concerning the Nembutsu, no working is true working, for it is beyond description, explanation, and conceptual understanding." But here we might begin to wonder if other power has been pushed so far that there is no longer a self to even contrast with an other. So in this case, there would be no duality between self and other because there is only other, which makes me think of the following poem by Saiichi Asahara, who lived from 1850 to 1932. His poem reads, "In other power, there is no self-power, no other power. All is other power. Namu Amida Butsu, Namu Amida Butsu." Also, in Record and Lament of Divergences, in response to the assertion that birth in the Pure Land is not settled for practitioners who do not read the sutras and commentaries and engage in study, Shinran is reported to have taught, "This statement must be declared hardly worth mentioning. All the sacred writings that clarify the significance of the truth and reality of other power state that one who entrusts oneself to the primal vow and says the Nembutsu attain Buddhahood. Apart from this, what learning is essential for birth?" So for Shinran, study is only for the purpose of clearing up confusion and allaying doubts about the salvation through entrusting oneself to the primal vow and the saying of Nembutsu. So here we have a faith in which there really is no practice, right? Because the practice is given to one and its workings are so mysterious, it seems one should not even properly call it a practice. And the only study is to see that there's really nothing to study except to just let go of everything and entrust oneself. At least this is my understanding. And I bring this up because I want to contrast this with Nichiren's perspective further on. So now let's talk about the interiority of Shinran's teaching. So this involves Shinjin, what I've been calling the mind of faith. So here, Shinran wrote from his Lamp for the Latter Ages. Actually, this is a collection of letters. He wrote, "As to the matter you raise, although the one moment of Shinjin and the one moment of Nembutsu are two, there is no Nembutsu separate from Shinjin, nor is the one moment of Shinjin separate from the one moment of Nembutsu." So this is fairly straightforward. For Shinran, the Nembutsu is not a practice, but a response of faith, a response given in the moment of hearing the vow and having no doubt that one is saved. So this is not just a practice of the lips, but really a emanation or outflow from the heart and mind. Oh, that word jin, by the way, or shin, sometimes it's pronounced, is the pronunciation of the character that could mean either heart or mind. So one could say the mind of faith or the heart of faith is what Shinjin is, and Shin being the character of faith. So now let's talk about non-retrogression, according to Shinran, which was mentioned before. So for both Shinran and Nichiren, salvation is really not just limited to the afterlife. And this may be surprising to some people who think that Pure Land Buddhism is solely about rebirth in the Pure Land. But Shinran really stressed a very fundamental change and shift in one's spiritual position at the moment of Shinjin in this life. So what is the stage of non-retrogression? It is basically a stage that an advanced bodhisattva reaches. In Sanskrit, it's called avivardhaka, where one has achieved a state where one is assured of attaining Buddhahood and will not fall away into the lesser goals of the arhats who just want to escape birth and death, or the privately awakened ones who also just want to escape birth and death. Rather, one is now assured of attaining Buddhahood for the sake of all beings. And in fact, one has achieved a stage where now practice becomes effortless, and one is on the very verge of attaining Buddhahood. So let's see what Shinran has to say about this. In his Hymns of the Pure Land, Shinran writes, "Those who attain true and real Shinjin immediately join the truly settled. Thus, having entered the stage of non-retrogression, they necessarily attain nirvana." So here, nirvana can be taken to mean Buddhahood. And further on in the Hymns of the Pure Land, he writes, "The person who attains Shinjin and joy is taught to be equal to the Tathagatas. Great Shinjin is itself Buddha nature. Buddha nature is none other than Tathagata." So when he says equal to the Tathagatas, Shinran means that one is equal to Maitreya Buddha, and therefore on the verge of Buddhahood. One needs only the right circumstances in which to be born into a world in need of a Buddha to roll the wheel of the Dharma. So Maitreya Buddha is, of course, in Buddhism, the bodhisattva who resides in the Tushita heaven, who is just waiting the right circumstances to be born in the Saha world to once again roll the wheel of the Dharma. So he's a Buddha in all but activity, one might say. So I take this to mean that one is qualified to be a Buddha, but is awaiting the right circumstances to exhibit Buddhahood. I would also note that Nichiren also in his Kanjin Hanzan show says that one's faith is a manifestation of the Buddha nature within. And here Shinran is equating Shinjin with Buddha nature. So I find that interesting. So now let's talk about Nichiren's perspective. So Nichiren, of course, revered the eternal Shakyamuni Buddha and not Amitabha Buddha. And actually, eternal Shakyamuni Buddha is really an English gloss. The name in Japanese is Kuan Jitsujo Honshi Shakyamuni Butsu, which literally means Shakyamuni Buddha, the original teacher who attained Buddhahood in the remotest past. So why is Shakyamuni Buddha called the eternal Buddha, original Buddha? In chapter 16, which in Nichiren Shu we recite the verses from chapter 16 as part of our regular services, and on very many occasions in Nichiren Shu temples, the entire chapter is recited. In that chapter, the Buddha says, all heavenly beings, humans, and asuras in all worlds say the Shakyamuni Buddha left the palace of the Shakya clan, sat down at the place of the way not far from the city of Gaia, and attained supreme perfect awakening. In fact, my good children, immeasurable, boundless hundreds of thousands and millions and myriads of kalpas have already passed since I became the Buddha. And also in the verses of chapter 16, he says, at times, for the sake of them all, I teach that a Buddha's lifespan is beyond measure. To those who see a Buddha only after a very long time, I teach that a Buddha is rarely met. Such is the power of my wisdom that its light shines infinitely. So, whereas for Shinran, Shakyamuni Buddha is just an emanation of Amitabha Buddha, from the perspective of the Lotus Sutra, the eternal Shakyamuni Buddha has the qualities of infinite life and infinite light. So Amitayus and Amitabha aren't what he is emanated from, but are rather his qualities. In accordance with Tiantai thought, Nichiren saw the eternal Shakyamuni Buddha as embodying not just one of the Buddha bodies, the accommodative or reward or Dharma body, but all three. He says in one of his writings, the Buddha revealed in the original gate of the Lotus Sutra is the one who attained Buddhahood in the remotest past. He too possesses the three kinds of Buddha body. In this eternal Buddha, the three bodies are fused in one, having no beginning and no ending, and he lives forever from the eternal past to the infinite future to guide the people. So, whereas in many forms of Mahayana Buddhism, they at least speak as though the Dharma body were the one true reality, almost in monistic terms at times, which frankly I think is a violation of Madhyamika thought. But they also see the reward bodies as emanating from the Dharma body, and the accommodative or historical Buddhas as emanating from these reward bodies in the Pure Lands. And you have almost what's more of a Neoplatonic system than a system based on emptiness and process thought of dependent origination. In Tiantai Buddhism, however, the Tiantai saw all three bodies as being mutually implicated in one another. So they were integral to each other, not simply lesser and lesser emanations in the Dharma body. And unlike in other forms of Buddhism that sees the Dharma body as having no birth and no death, whereas the reward body has a beginning but no definite end, and the accommodative or historical body having a birth and death, Tiantai saw all three, being dharmas, as having no birth and no death, which, of course, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras and Madhyamika thought teaches that all phenomena actually, being without substance, empty of self-nature, have no birth and no death. So that's very complicated. I threw that out real fast, but the point is that in Nichiren Buddhism, we see all three bodies as being presented in the eternal Shakyamuni Buddha. So why did the eternal Shakyamuni Buddha teach the Lotus Sutra? In this passage from the chapter 2, the Buddha says, Shariputra, why do I say that the world-honored ones appear in the world only because of the one great cause? This is sometimes called the one great purpose. To make this short, I'll just say they appear in the world to open the eyes of the people to the knowledge and insight of the Buddhas, to demonstrate the knowledge and insight of the Buddhas to all people, to help people realize the knowledge and insight of the Buddhas, and to enable people to embark upon the way to the knowledge and insight of the Buddhas. So this opening, demonstrating, realizing, and embarking are the four phrases that sum up the purpose for which the Lotus Sutra is taught, and the purpose for which the Buddhas appear in the worlds. And further on in chapter 21, where we have what in Nichiren Buddhism we call the specific transmission of the Dharma, the Lotus Sutra, to these bodhisattvas who are very advanced, like they're Buddhas in all but name, who have appeared from under the earth. Actually, it says they appear from the sky or emptiness beneath the ground. So one might take this metaphorically to mean from the emptiness within the bodhisattva stages, and they appear in the worlds specifically to teach beings in the latter age of the Dharma, when the Buddha the Buddha Dharma is about to fade away. So in chapter 21, the Buddha transmits to them the wonderful Dharma Lotus Sutra in the following words. Essentially speaking, all of the truths belonging to the Tathagata, all of the free and unhindered transcendent powers of the Tathagata, all the innermost essentials in the treasury of the Tathagata, and all the extremely profound deeds of the Tathagata are in their totality proclaimed and revealed in this sutra. So, how is this presented in the latter age? Nichiren would say in the Daimoku, that the Daimoku contains these truths, powers, essentials, and deeds. He writes in Kanjin Hanzen Sho, however, the intention behind these passages is that the two dharmas of the causal practices and virtuous effects of Shakyamuni, the world-honored one, are perfectly contained in the 5 characters in the title, the Sutra of the Lotus Flower of the Wonderful Dharma. In other words, perfectly contained in the 5 characters Myoho Renge Kyo. When we accept and uphold these 5 characters, the merits of these causes and effects are naturally transferred to us. So, we've talked about the primal vows of Amitabha Buddha. Does the eternal Shakyamuni Buddha present any primal vows or original vow? In fact, in Lotus Sutra, we do find that he voices a vow. In the beginning, he says, you should know, or early on in the sutra, he says, you should know, Shariputra, that from the beginning I made a vow, desiring all living beings to be my equals, with no distinctions between us. Now what I vowed so long ago has been perfectly fulfilled, for I'm transforming all living beings and enabling them to embark upon the Buddha way. So the Buddha has made this vow to make all equal to himself and is now claiming that this has been fulfilled. At the end of chapter 16, the Buddha says, I always know living beings, those who practice the way and those who do not, and for their sake expound various teachings to liberate each of them accordingly. I am ever thinking, how can I cause living beings to embark upon the unsurpassable way and quickly accomplish embodiment as Buddhas? So in Shinran's teaching, he often refers to Amida as the one who grasps and never abandons us. But here we see the Lotus Sutra is also saying that the Buddha's constant thought is, how can I get each one of you to enter the unsurpassable way and quickly attain Buddhahood? And again, Nichiren believed that this was accomplished or manifest in the world through the practice of Daimoku. So why chant the Daimoku? First of all, Nichiren did not invent the Daimoku. It was part of liturgies from a very early period. But what Nichiren did was he made it central. He made it a primary practice. So he basically had to justify this with citations to the Lotus Sutra and also from the Nirvana Sutra, as we'll see. So let's just look at those very quickly. There. According to the Lotus Sutra, even to encounter the name of the sutra is a rare and wonderful opportunity. As the Buddha says, Manjushri, in countless lands, even the name of this Dharma Flower Sutra cannot be heard, much less can it be seen, received, embraced, read, or recited. And throughout the Lotus Sutra, I'll point out that the Buddha talks about 5 practices of those who uphold the Lotus Sutra, or the practitioners of the Lotus Sutra, which is keeping and receiving, reading, reciting, copying, and expounding the sutra. So he's talking about the rarity of being able to do this with even the name of the sutra. In another passage where different rakshasis or fierce spirits are enunciating dharanis or spells to protect the practitioner of the Lotus Sutra, the Buddha says to them, good, good. Were you able only to protect those who receive and embrace the name of the Dharma flower, your merits would be beyond measure. So if one receives merits beyond measure for protecting those who only embrace the name, then of course those who are actually receiving and embracing the name will receive even more boundless merits. So this is also taken as justification for the practice of Daimoku. Finally, we have this passage in the Nirvana Sutra. And any good men or women who hear the sutra's name will not be reborn in any of the 4 unfortunate realms. So Nichiren, as well as Tiantai, looked upon the Nirvana Sutra as a reiteration of the Lotus Sutra. So Nichiren took anything the Nirvana Sutra said about the benefits of practicing it as relating also to the Lotus Sutra. And here, as I mentioned before, to not be reborn in any of the 4 unfortunate realms, the hells, hungry ghosts, animals, fighting demons, is basically the same as saying that one has entered the stream of the Dharma. that one will now, within a limited number of lifetimes, attain nirvana. So, neither self nor other. In Shinran's teaching, we saw that he focused solely on other power. Nichiren, however, dodged this dichotomy between self and other power. Like his Tiantai predecessors, Nichiren is wary of these kinds of dualities and falling down onto any one position. So, in one of his earlier writings, where he's surveying Buddha's teachings for his followers, he wrote, "At this time, the Lotus Sutra establishes self-power, but is not self-power. This is because the self includes the 10 realms of all sentient beings. And from the beginning, we contain the Buddha realm of both ourselves and all sentient beings. Therefore, our becoming a Buddha does not bring a new Buddha into the world. The Lotus Sutra also establishes other power, but is not other power. The Buddha who is other is contained within the selves of ordinary people. This other Buddha makes himself the same as our own Buddhahood." So here Nichiren is making use of the Tiantai doctrine of the mutual possession of the 10 realms, which teaches that the 6 realms of rebirth of the hells, hungry ghosts, animals, titans or fighting demons, humans and gods, as well as the 4 noble states of voice hearers, privately awakened ones, bodhisattvas, and Buddhas, are all mutually entailing, that is completely integral to each other and mutually implicated. They all contain and are contained by the others in various ways and to various degrees. So in every single thought moment, all of these realms, and in fact all of life, is always included, contained, and to some degree or another expressed. For Nichiren and the Tiantai schools, there is no ontological gap between these realms, and they are all always present, even if some are more conspicuously present than others. So, it's not a question of us needing to get Buddhahood. We, in a sense, already have Buddhahood. We already are Buddhahood. But what is it that we're presenting to the world? What is it that we're able to relate to amongst all of this myriad, all these myriad elements of our lives in each thought moment? In this passage from one of Nichiren's writings that is often cited in Nichiren Shu, it is clear that he does encourage his followers to strive to practice and study Buddhism, though he sees both as rooted in or as expressions of faith. And by doing this, we bring out that Buddhahood that is already, in some sense, there. So he writes, "Have faith in the great Mandala Gohonzon, the most venerable one in the entire world. Earnestly endeavor to strengthen your faith so that you may be blessed with the protective powers of Shakyamuni Buddha, the Buddha of many treasures, and Buddhas in manifestation throughout the universe. Strive to carry out the 2 ways of practice and learning. Without practice and learning, Buddhism will cease to exist. Endeavor yourself and cause others to practice these 2 ways of practice and learning which stem from faith. If possible, please spread even a word or a phrase of the sutra to others." So now let's talk about the interiority of Daimoku. As we saw, the interiority of Nembutsu is Shenjin, but the interiority of the Daimoku practice is Ichinen Zuiki, which means the single moment of rejoicing, or Ichinen Shinge, which is the single moment of understanding by faith, or sometimes translated faith and understanding. Here's what Nichiren says about this. "Beginners should refrain from giving alms, observing the precepts, and the rest of the first 5 bodhisattva practices, and for the present should instead take up the practice of Namu Myoho Renge Kyo, which is the spirit of the single moment of understanding by faith in the stage of rejoicing. This is the true intention of the Lotus Sutra." So here, Nichiren is arguing, the context for this is Nichiren is arguing that a beginner would just be overwhelmed trying to practice the 6 perfections of the Bodhisattva. And then in any case, the first 5 perfections need to be guided by the 6th, which is wisdom. But obviously we have no wisdom, or we would already be Buddhas. So Nichiren says that we need to replace wisdom with faith, at least initially. And looking at passages in Lotus Sutra, he sees that the immense benefit of a single moment of understanding by faith, or of rejoicing in what the Buddha teaches, which is an expression of faith, far outweighs any of our imperfect, finite attempts to practice the first 5 perfections, and will in fact lead to the blossoming of wisdom, which will allow us to perfect all 6 perfections. So For those that may wonder, here are I'm going to share the passages in Lotus Sutra where Nichiren derives this teaching. One is from chapter 10 about the teachers of the Dharma, where the Buddha says, I also bestow the assurance of supreme perfect awakening upon those people who, after the passing of the Tathagata, hear even a single verse or a single phrase of the wondrous Dharma Flower Sutra, and thereby experience even a moment of rejoicing. And in chapter 17, the Buddha says, Ajita, those people who have heard that the lifespan of the Buddha is of such long duration and have been able to experience even a single moment of faith and understanding will attain merits beyond limit and measure. So I take merits beyond limit and measure to mean the incalculable merit of actually being able to attain Buddhahood, not some kind of finite worldly benefit. So in Nichiren, some people think that he doesn't talk about the Pure Land or going to a Pure Land, but in fact he does. And here's a couple passages relating to that. In an early writing entitled Shugo Kokoran, or Treatise on Protecting the Nation, Nichiren has the following dialogue. Which Pure Land should practitioners of the Lotus Sutra pray to be born into? His answer is that it is stated in the 16th chapter on the lifespan of the Buddha, the essence of the Lotus Sutra consisting in 28 chapters, that I will always stay in this Saha world. This is the Buddha speaking. I reside here always, and this world of mine is at peace. So according to these statements, the eternal true Buddha, the origin of all Buddhas in manifestation, is always in this Saha world. Then why should we wish to be anywhere other than this Saha world? You should know that there is no Pure Land other than the very place where the practitioner of the Lotus Sutra resides. Why should we concern ourselves seeking a Pure Land in any other place? So here I should perhaps remind everyone that Pure Land is not just a heavenly realm, a place where you just kind of enjoy pleasure for infinity or eternity. Rather, a Pure Land in Buddhism is envisioned as a place where all the conditions are conducive to quickly attaining Buddhahood. So what he's saying here is that this is actually the place where we can live in the presence of the Buddha. This is the place where the conditions are conducive for attaining Buddhahood, even though we may not immediately perceive it, even though we may not be able to perceive the Buddhahood within ourselves. However, later, and especially from the time of the Sado exile on, and this excerpt I'm going to share is from a passage from his cover letter to Kanjin Hanzon-sho, one of his most important writings about the focus of devotion and mental contemplation. He began to talk about being reborn in the Pure Land of Mount Sacred Eagle, where Shakyamuni Buddha was supposed to have taught the Lotus Sutra. So here he says, it is my wish that by observing this one view, when our lives come to an end, as teacher and students together, we will visit the Pure Land of Mount Sacred Eagle and have a face-to-face audience with the three Buddhas, Shakyamuni, many treasures, and the emanation Buddhas of the 10 directions. So this is this idea that while we may be able to manifest or realize Buddhahood to some degree here and now through our faith in the Lotus Sutra and the practice of Daimoku, there may need to be a culmination after death where one then sees clearly what was true all along. Now let's talk about non-retrogression according to Nichiren. In the Lotus Sutra it says, the Buddha is speaking, Shariputra, I teach this, the seal of my Dharma, desiring to benefit the world. So wherever you go, do not transmit it recklessly. If those who hear it joyfully receive and revere it, you should know that these people are non-regressors. So according to the Lotus Sutra, those who receive and practice the Lotus Sutra joyfully, and here we talk again about Ichinen Zuiki, will be able to attain this stage of non-retrogression. Nichiren, in a dialogue that opens his treatise on the Daimoku of the Lotus Sutra, has this question. Suppose there is a person who does not understand the meaning of the Lotus Sutra or the doctrines described in it. Is it possible for such a person to avoid falling into the four evil realms and eventually proceed to the state of non-retrogression, even becoming a Buddha, if this person chants the Daimoku Namu Myoho Renge Kyo in earnest, just once in a day, month, year, or lifetime? And he says, I could not agree with you more. Finally, I must add that Nichiren did believed that at least to a certain degree, people could attain Sokoshin Jobutsu, or the attainment of Buddhahood in one's very body. He usually writes about this in connection with funerals, with the body of the deceased. But there are times, such as in this letter, excerpt from a letter written to a lay follower late in his life, where he talks about how it is realized through our actual practice of Daimoku. He writes, "It is said that the merit of all the Buddhist scriptures, except the Lotus Sutra, is found in the promise that men can become Buddhas after they have done good deeds, which means the attainment of Buddhahood is not certain. In the case of the Lotus Sutra, however, when one touches it, one's hands immediately become Buddhas, and when one chants it, one's mouth instantly becomes a Buddha." So, in conclusion, whoops, just a moment. I'm having a little trouble with my cursor here. So basically, in conclusion, Shinran and Nichiren, each in their own way, were asserting a way to Buddhahood through faith. Of course, Shinran was devoted to Amitabha Buddha and the primal vow. Nichiren did so through the eternal Shakyamuni Buddha and the practice of Daimoku. But as we can see, in some ways, their positions came very close. The idea of non-retrogression and the idea of a final culmination at death for those who would not or could not fully realize it in this life. So here I bring my talk to an end, and I hope that I have been able to help people understand a little bit about what Shinran and Nichiren stood for. As I said before, I've not gotten into the polemics and criticisms and counter-criticisms between the two schools, but I really think that you need to start from a more positive base. You need to understand what they were for before you can begin talking about what they were against or what they found to be critical of. So in this way, I hope this will foster a great understanding and further dialogue in the future. And with that, I will bring my talk to a close. Thank you all very much.
Sensei, thank you so much. I'm so surprised in your deep understanding about Shinran Shonin's teaching. It's so fascinating. Thank you. So,
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So before we have Q&A with participants, I'd like to ask Reverend Peter Hata here. He is our Jōdo Shinshū Higashi minister. Please give us some comments about Reverend McCormick's lecture. And if you have some question, please share with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Osei. Well, first I wanted to say thank you to Reverend McCormick. That was a very in-depth discussion of Shinran, and I after a while I was wondering, when are you going to start talking about Nichiren? Because it was very thorough. And another thing is that I was very fortunate to meet Reverend McCormick. I don't know, was that maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago? We had a short Zoom discussion, and I think sort of in line with what Reverend McCormick is saying is that we normally would not maybe have this kind of dialogue because we have these traditions or schools that we belong to, but certainly I think when we think about the bigger picture of all Buddhist traditions, I would say, not just Jōdo Shinshū or Nichiren Shu, I think this is what we should be doing is realizing our commonalities, if you will. And I think, so I really appreciate Reverend McCormick's lecture. I just wanted to maybe just mention a couple of things here that sort of build on what Sensei said. One of the things about the 18th vow, my understanding of it is that, or of the 48 vows in general, is that one of the differences between Shinran and Honen is that Honen really did emphasize the 18th vow, but Shinran is said to have actually, in a sense, emphasized the 17th vow. So the 17th vow says, all Buddhist Tathagatas in the 10 quarters, as numerous as the sands of the river Ganges, together, or actually this is from the fulfillment passage, together praise the inconceivable supernal virtue of Amitayus. And so, whereas the 18th vow, as Sensei pointed out, guarantees Shinjin, or birth in the Pure Land, for those who attain this faith in Amida, the 17th vow seems to emphasize, actually, according to Shinran's interpretation, us hearing, us listening to the Buddhas saying the name of Amida, Namo Amida Butsu, rather than us necessarily attaining or receiving Shinjin. It's us hearing and listening to the Buddhas praising Namo Amida Butsu. And so, in that sense, as my teachers have explained to me, this is a reflection on Shinran's deep respect for his teacher Honen as his teacher, and really all teachers. And so, in that sense, this sort of ties into Shinran's emphasis on, as Sensei mentioned, other power, or we would say, you maybe use the term tariki, or power beyond the self. In other words, Shinran so deeply respected his teachers, not only Honen, but the 7 masters of the Pure Land tradition, one of which was Tanwan, as you mentioned, maybe one of the most influential teachers on Shinran, so much so that he, I would say, had such a deep sense of his own limitations, his own self-limitations, that he did not feel, capable of anything other than listening to his teachers. And so I think this is the way that we interpret the 17th vow. So from maybe this is, and I'm not sure if this is Higashi versus Nishi kind of thing, because I understand, well, throughout Higashi, there is a continuum of interpretations of the of Shinran's teaching, and throughout Nishi Hongangi, there's also a continuum. And there's a continuum between the two Honganji's understanding of Shinran's teaching. And I think it's actually, I think this representative is represented by your lecture today, Reverend McCormick, is that, actually, even in Nichiren Shu, the interpretation is evolving over time. It may take a lot of time, but it's evolving. And I think so. This is my understanding from teachers that I've heard fairly recently, or in my studies, that the 17th vow is actually in some ways more important to Shinran than the 18th vow. Although, or certainly, the 18th vow is the teaching of his teacher Honen. Another thing is this. I think what you said about birth in the Pure Land, and it as being, sometimes understood to be birth in the Pure Land after death. And I think this is another area that's sort of maybe still controversial in Pure Land Buddhism and in Shin Buddhism. And I think my teachers that I've listened to, I think, have said that, Shinjin, according to Shinran, means awakening. And this awakening means birth in the Pure Land, but this birth is not an ending. I think Shinran's understanding of it is that this birth is a beginning. It's a beginning. So in that sense, it resonates with what you said about non-retrogression, or maybe the Sanskrit term sotapanna, or stream entry. The Shinjin represents a beginning, and therefore, in this life, as we live our lives, we keep deepening our Shinjin. So then, in a sense, birth in the Pure Land becomes our true entry on the path as true followers of the Buddha, of the Dharma. And so this is, in a sense, the Dharma, as we keep listening to it, as we become people with the spirit of Nembutsu, or Namo Amida Butsu, our lives become permeated with the Dharma. And, just another thing is that that's my understanding that is the sort of one of the deeper meanings of Nembutsu. As Shinran has said, that it represents really all the teachings of the Buddha and of Buddhism. It's the having the mind of this listener, this bowing, humble person that's deeply listening to the Dharma and seeking the Dharma. And also, I think this is in line with many of the things that you quoted from Nichiren, a person who's committed to sharing the Dharma with other people. This is a very important part. And I think it's maybe, you didn't go into it, but it's this Mahayana tradition that I think ties Nichiren and Jōdo Shinshū together in the larger picture that I have begun learning more about, and I'm really very interested in the Mahayana, development of the Mahayana. And then one final thing, I wanted to mention also that, in contrast to what Reverend Osa said about not knowing anything about Nichiren teaching, actually, one of our Higashi ministers, Reverend Futoshi Takehashi, this was about 8 years ago, he actually came to the Higashi Hongangi Los Angeles Betsuin and gave a lecture on the meaning of Higashi Hongangi rituals. And he actually pointed out exactly what you pointed out about that verse from the Hymns of the Pure Land, where Shinran says, "It is taught that 10 kalpas have now passed since Amida attained Buddhahood, but he seems a Buddha more ancient than kalpas countless as particles." So Reverend Reverend Takahashi is saying that this is from the Lotus Sutra. This is from that most important chapter that you mentioned, chapter 16, that the Buddha is eternal. And so, I think according to Takahashi Sensei, this again is a very kind of Mahayana idea of however you want to conceive of it as a Buddha being eternal and always with us. And in a sense, the only thing that prevents us from becoming awakened or receiving that faith, that trust, is our hearing and our listening to it sincerely. And so there's this eternal quality of the Buddha that, according to Takahashi Sensei, shows that Shinran studied the Lotus Sutra. Of course, he studied the Nirvana Sutra a great deal, and in fact, in his Kyōgyo Shinsho, there's a lot of quotes from the Nirvana Sutra, and as you pointed out, the Nirvana Sutra and the Lotus Sutra are very closely aligned in many ways. Let's see, I think, one other thing I wanted to point out, because I think just going back to what I was talking about, this idea of Namu Amida Butsu, that the idea of Shinran's sort of juxtaposing, this self or the self, and then the self of the human self, and then the Amida Buddha, and so kind of talking about it, as you put it, a duality that exists there. I think, in a sense, I guess you could see it as a duality, but in another sense, Shinran's, I think the tradition of Jōdo Shinshū, as a tradition of Nichiren Shu, in many ways reflects the sort of personality of Shinran Shonin. It's not a personality cult, but it's a personality that I think he sort of attained or received through his many trials and tribulations, one of which you mentioned is exile to Echigo. And so when he said, I'm neither priest nor lay, many teachers in Jōdo Shinshū see that as a statement of non-duality, because you had the priest, which he was a priest, and then he was exiled from that and stripped of his priesthood. And then he became a lay person in Echigo and had to basically become a farmer. I think, there's some historical evidence that while he was there in Echigo, he transcended that duality. And that's why he said, I'm no longer priest nor lay. I'm sort of transcending that. And I think, my understanding of it, this is just my own interpretation of it, that sort of manifests in his deep understanding of Namu Amida Butsu. In other words, Namu meaning, this listening or bowing spirit, and Amida Butsu representing the Dharma itself, or the Dharmakaya. And so what he achieved, or he received after this life of many hardships and benefit from his teachers like Honen, is, and also because of his sort of extreme, deep awareness of his own self-limitations, which he spoke about throughout his life. He called himself a bombu. He said that, he famously said, when the one thought moment of joy arises, Shinjin, nirvana is attained. but nirvana is attained without severing blind passions. Again, sort of a non-duality of saying, as we say in Mahayana Buddhism, nirvana and samsara are really the same. I think that's something that you said, Nichiren sort of reflected on. And so that, I think, in my understanding, is sort of emanates from Shinran's own deep awareness of his own self-limitations. That's all he could do was just praise the Dharma and sort of listen to it. So those are just a few minor points, but they're more like adding on to what you so generously provided us with, a very deep appreciation of Shinran's teaching and also of Nichiren's teaching. So again, I want to, on behalf of Higashi Hongangi and myself personally, I want to thank you for your presentation. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I especially appreciate what you pointed out about the kind of the open-endedness of that moment of faith and insight in this life. And, you know, that neither teacher said, okay, that's it, now you got it all. It's like, if that were the case, it would be very static. It would be very disillusioning. You know, oh, is this it? Like that Peggy Lee song, is that all there is? But because both of them taught, like, there's this immense change of heart and sense of assurance, and that it just keeps opening up. I think I really appreciate that open-endedness of what they're teaching. And also what you said about 17th vow is true. In fact, for time, I had to cut out some of my slides, which were specifically about the 17th vow. So I appreciate you bringing that in. And one of the things I found fascinating that I had no time for was to talk about the way Shinran shows this dynamic between vows 17 through 20. And especially the, you know, between vows 19 and 20, where one goes from a state of, well, I'm going to do all these practices to build up merit so I can be born in the Pure Land, to, well, I can't really do that. And according to the 20th vow, I'll just chant Nembutsu. And if I do enough Nembutsu, I'll get born in the Pure Land. And then you go from that to, you know what, I can't do anything for myself. It's just got to be this other. So this progression I find very interesting.